Poet Kynpham Sing Nongkynrih's debut novel, Funeral Nights, will be released in July. Published by Westland, Nongkynrih's magnum opus is a closely woven sequence of narratives that provides us a profound insight into the working of the tribal psyche. Poet K. Sachidanandan writes, "Today, we are in conversation with Nongkynrih to know more about the book and the novelist's journey."
I have always wanted to write about my people, the Khasis, because sometimes I read about people, journalists, writers, visiting the place, like fly-by-night operators. They come here and they write all sorts of nonsense. I should write something to present the true picture of the Khasi people. I didn't want to just write an essay or a non-fiction piece. I wanted to write something that is both instructive and delightful. I was looking around, for a narrative frame. Then I thought of the Khasi funeral nights. Khasi funerals, normally the dead body is kept for 2 nights, and during these 2 nights people come from far and near, relatives and friends, and to condole, and they spend most of the night in the death house, telling stories and sharing many interesting things. But then that is only part of the narrative frame. It's not a complete picture. There's a lot of poetry in the book too. In fact, there are lots of things in the book.
How many years did you take to finish the book? How was your research process?
It was Kartika who excited me into it. I mean, I've been thinking about writing a book about the Khazis, but it was Kartika, when he heard what I was planning in my mind, that was 2008. She enthused me into it. She was then the CEO of HarperCollins. So I started researching for the book. And I went to Lingam, and I explored the area, and then I read extensively, but not only about Lingam. I read extensively about the entire Khasi people. That took a long time, and then I found that it was difficult for me, to really sit down and write the novel because I'm also teaching. 2016, I was able to take a sabbatical, and I finished writing the book within 1 year. Initially, the book contained 1,600 pages. So you can imagine, editing 1,600 pages like 5-6 novels in one book. I submitted to HarperCollins, Penguin, and Westland. They all accepted, but finally I decided to go with Context Westland, because Kartika is the publisher there. So it has been a long time, since 2008 I started the research, wrote it down in 2016, and it would have been out by 2019, but because of the pandemic it didn't happen. Most of these stories I've collected since childhood, told to me by my mother, my uncles, and elders. Others where I came to know more recently from friends and colleagues, and so everything is made use of.
Nongkynrih grew up in Sora. The beauty, tradition, culture, and stories of the place influenced his works immensely. For the poet, Sora is everything.
Sora represents the happiest time of my life, and if there is anything like paradise in this life for me, it would be my childhood in Sora. I used to dream of that childhood in Sora again and again. It's like an escape for me, especially when I feel oppressed by the things I see around me, I experience in this city.
The new book not only has stories from Nongkynrih's childhood, but also reflects on the various issues afflicting the Khasi society. That is his way of speaking up against injustice.
This novel especially is going to be very controversial because the characters, they take up a lot of controversial issues to debate.
Okay.
For example, among the Khasis, we have some very serious issues as a society. We have this great divide between the Khasis and Jaintias. The Panar, most of the Panar people nowadays, for example, prefer to call themselves Jaintias, and they don't want to consider themselves as part of the Khasis. So the characters debate on that. Then there is another great divide between Khasi Christians and Khasi Khasis. There is a heated debate in society. There is also a heated debate in the book. Then they talk a lot about corruption. They talk a lot about the influx issue and how dangerous the influx issue, both for the Khasi people as well as for the non-Khasis, because the issue of influx here is always tied up with the other ugly issue here, which is communal riot. One of the most important social issues for Khasi is the question of origin. This is also taken up in the book. So although I'm not visible in the social media, in the print media, in the electronic media, it's not true that I don't engage with social issues, and there are many people like me. They just don't want the hassle, of facing unfair and carping criticism, because they don't have the time to respond to them. And if I write a book, whether people like it or not, it's there, and it will be there for as long as humans are there. So Shell Live is much more than what is published in the newspapers and so on.
Who were the authors, who were the writers who influenced you?
I was mostly reading Khasi books, but also translations, especially translations from Greek mythology. When I came to Shillong, when I stayed in a hostel, I started reading. I was in class 7. I started reading novels for the first time, and I remember, the first novel I read was a western by Louis Le Mans, and since then, I became I became an ardent fan of Louis Le Mans. Then, of course, I started borrowing books from those book lending libraries. I think, unfortunately, most of them are gone now. There were lots of them in those days. So I used to borrow all sorts of books, westerns, romances, detective novels. It was only later, that I started reading poetry when I went to college, and I was, and I think I was greatly influenced by European poets, East European poets especially, Latin American poets, African poets, poets from the Middle East, and of course, when I started writing, I read a lot of poetry by Indian writers, dead and alive. I have many favorites. But the strongest influences were, from poets like Pablo Neruda and Chiswolf Miwoj, Theodore Argesi from East European poets, and then poets like Darwish from the Middle East, and Syed Ahmad Syed or Adonis. And I also read lots of Japanese and Chinese and Korean poetry.
Okay.
Maybe that is the reason why one of my books published by Penguin is a book of haiku, It's called Time's Barter. I make it a point to read poetry, before I sleep. And right now I'm reading Yaroslav's poetry. But in between, I also read prose works. But because of my eyes, I've started listening to audiobooks. I'm very eclectic in my reading taste. I've been listening to books by Knut Hamsun, the Nobel laureate. I read a book that holds me, and however famous or popular an author is, if I read the first few pages and if they do not hold me, I stop reading.
About this ongoing pandemic, was last year's pandemic and the lockdown affect your creative space in any way?
At that time, I was editing my novel, Funeral Nights, but then something strange also happened. I read Dante's Vita Nuova, his collection of sonnets again, and I was inspired by his spiritual love for Beatrice, whom he wrote again in the Divine Comedy. So, and I started writing a verse romance. It's called Nameri, and many of the poems have been published here and there now. And so throughout the pandemic, I worked on this verse romance. It's a single poem comprising 208 short poems. It's full of ruminations about the pandemic, and philosophical issues like time and space and human relationships, and so it's a very complex mix. But the basic theme is the exploration of spiritual love.
Nongkynrih's novel portrays the Khasi society in myriad hues. He weaves stories together to give an insight into the tribal life. It is the poet's journey, from verses to prose, with deep introspection.